At this very moment, you're probably using something that was made by a family that exploited 55,000 slave laborers during World War II. This family, amongst many other things, controlled the steel industry, but they also armed Hitler and helped build his gas chambers. And after the war, not only did they get a full pardon, but they also kept their billions. This is the bizarre story of the Krupp family, the Nazi war criminals who are still in business today. At their height, the Krupps were one of the world's leading steelmakers and arms manufacturers. They were so powerful that from their mansion in Essen, the family hosted emperors, kings, and world leaders. Industrialists, politicians, army generals, and heads of states came to negotiate contracts with the Krupps that would shape the course of wars and economies. Kaiser Wilhelm I once called Krupp a national institution. It was a statement that captured how deeply the company had become intertwined with the German state. Krupp was part of Germany's identity, a symbol of its industrial might and military ambition. Krupp's reach and reputation was so strong that almost every major army during World War I was using its products. Its guns, shells, and armor were deployed on all sides of the conflict. And with the war over and Germany in ruin, the company only saw further expansion. The scale of the Krupp empire became staggering. The company owned 87 industrial complexes, controlled over 110 firms, and held significant stakes in 142 other corporations within Germany itself. Abroad, it maintained operations in nearly every European country, owning over half of the shares of 41 foreign plants and large holdings in another 25. Few families in history have commanded such global industrial power. Even fewer had turned their country's crisis into further leverage for their own benefit. But that was exactly what the Krupps excelled at. During World War II, even the Nazi regime gave the family cautious respect. Adolf Hitler personally ensured that the Krupp family retained full control of its empire. In a formal decree, the Führer declared that the owner of the Krupp family property be empowered to set up a family business with special arrangements as to succession. I mean, this was very unusual and it was huge for them. This effectively made Krupp untouchable, exempt from the many wartime restrictions that were imposed on other families. The Nazis saw their cooperation as vital to sustaining the war machine. What's astonishing is that the Krupp empire even survived the collapse of the Third Reich. Despite the atrocities the Krupp family business committed under the Nazis, the family faced very little consequence. But here's what should actually terrify you, because they never went away. They just changed their name. Look, if you ever stepped into an elevator or boarded a cruise ship or went to a hospital, chances are you're using one of their products. They just changed their name to ThyssenKrupp, and now they make elevators, industrial equipment for ships, hospitals, factories, you name it. But to understand how war criminals became respectable businessmen today, we need to go back to where this all began. Because what's even more surprising is that they weren't even German to begin with. The Krupp started as Dutch plague profiteers. When the Black Death hit, Arndt Krupp brought up land from fleeing families for pennies. That kind of soulless opportunism would later become the family trademark. Now, fast forward to 1811, and Friedrich Krupp is secretly selling steel to Napoleon and the Russian Tsars who are fighting him. The family basically never let principles get in the way of profit. The first known Krupp to be remembered by history was Arndt Krupp that I mentioned earlier. He wasn't some nobleman or iron tycoon. He was just a humble merchant selling anything he could get his hands on. And that included ironware, wine, livestock, food, even bits of real estate. Basically, if he could turn a profit, he dealt in it. Arndt and his family would eventually move east into what is now called Germany. He took advantage of a plague that hit the country. When locals fled the outbreak, he bought up their land for cheap. That move set the stage for the family's first real fortune. Over the next few generations, the Krupps grew comfortable, but they weren't famous yet. I mean, sure, they had money and land, but they didn't have any industry or power. But all that changed in 1811 with Friedrich Krupp. He was ambitious and he knew that the world was changing. He wanted to take advantage of this new frontier. He set up a small cast steel factory in Essen, and at that time, crucible steel was cutting-edge technology. This was basically a carbon-rich steel that was exceptionally pure and very strong for the time. And it was very difficult to make. The British closely guarded that process. Friedrich became obsessed with cracking that secret. His early attempts nearly bankrupted him, but he laid the groundwork for what was to come. Now, this was at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had issued a continental blockade of Britain to strangle their economy, but this also cut off much of Europe from British goods. And that's where Friedrich Krupp saw an opportunity. Along with two partners, he set out to replace the market with his own steel. When his partners dropped out, Friedrich took full control in 1816, determined to succeed at all costs. He quickly became a seller to Napoleon and the Russian Tsars. They needed high-quality steel for their cannons, which Krupp provided. Now, this went against German interests because both empires wanted to keep the German lands broken. They didn't want a united Germany, but Krupp still chose profit over national interest. But you see, there was a problem. His ambition came at a cost. The process became too expensive and the profits didn't keep up with his expectation. By the way, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you wanted access to this video 24 hours before anyone else, before it goes public, you could have gotten it through my Substack newsletter. Use this QR code on the screen or the link in the description to get exclusive early access. Alright, back to the video. To make matters worse for Krupp, another German family was trying to strike rich in the steel and ore industry. The Thyssen family that I mentioned earlier. The Krupps were finally facing some real competition. In the end, Friedrich's finances had collapsed. When he died in 1826, he left behind a debt-ridden workshop and a dream that seemed destined to fade. Alfred Krupp changed everything with one brilliant yet evil insight, and that was wars were getting deadlier, and someone was expected to supply the equipment. At the 1851 London exhibition, he unveiled a cannon that made every other weapon obsolete. Orders poured in from 46 nations, many of whom would soon use those same cannons against each other. He employed 75,000 workers and lived in a 300-room mansion during this time. He was eccentric, secretive, and tireless, often working through nights to perfect steel casting. But he had this gift that his father lacked, a remarkable business sense. Alfred realized that the family couldn't rely on selling steel bars forever, so instead he turned to railway equipment, which was growing in demand. He perfected seamless steel wheels and rails for the industry. But his light bulb moment came when he turned his steel factories from civilian applications to military ones. His business acumen was celebrated heavily. Newspapers began to call him Alfred the Great or the Cannon King. This shift towards military hardware also meant that he didn't have to compete with the family's main rival. The Thyssen family built their own vast iron and steel empire in Mulheim. The head of the family, August Thyssen, would later become known as the Rockefeller of the Ruhr. Now, over the next few decades, both Alfred Krupp and August Thyssen would define Germany's industrial power, sometimes as rivals and sometimes as partners. Now, Alfred didn't just confine his products to the German market. Like his father, he also chose to sell to anyone willing to offer a good price, and he was never short of buyers. Long before marketing was even a well-known word, he understood the value of image. He knew that reputation could sell as well as quality. To that end, he would use world expos to promote his products. Expositions or expos were basically the 19th century equivalent of global trade shows, but with much larger clients showing up. Think heads of state, military generals, and royalty, something you don't see today. He also invested heavily in photography, commissioning dramatic images of his factories and products. Rails and pipes didn't turn heads, but giant steel cannons? Now that attracted instant attention. His biggest success came in 1851. Alfred unveiled his cast steel cannon at London's Crystal Palace exhibition, stunning onlookers and silencing skeptics. The weapon was a technical marvel. It was stronger, more accurate, and more reliable than anything of its kind. Krupp soon became a household name across Europe. 2 decades later, his guns would prove decisive when Prussia went to war against France. The Prussian army's victory owed much to Krupp's field artillery, which easily outperformed the French bronze cannons. The war's outcome made Krupp guns a status symbol. Every nation that wanted to project power had to acquire a piece of Krupp steel. Alfred had inherited a company that was little more than a tiny workshop and 4 employees, and he turned it into a global powerhouse, employing 75,000 workers by the time he died in 1887. He had armed 46 nations and reshaped the balance of power in Europe. He became as much a force in geopolitics as in manufacturing. The business would pass on to his son, Friedrich Alfred Krupp. If his father was a savvy marketer, Friedrich was something else entirely, a cold, calculating politician disguised as a businessman. And in many ways, he was exactly the kind of man that the family empire needed to navigate the chaos of the early 20th century. Friedrich wasn't content with simply running factories. He knew that if the family business was to last, he had to wield influence. You know, the kind that came from being tied to banks and the state. Under his leadership, the Krupp Empire built close relationships with Germany's major commercial banks. These financial ties unlocked massive new growth. Bankers joined Krupp's board, and Krupp directors sat in the banks. It was all part of a larger trend in German industry that was politely termed rationalization. But in reality, it was basically a concentration of power into fewer and fewer hands. A German business magazine at the time said, "Other banks will follow the same path, and in time, the 300 men who today govern Germany economically will be reduced to 50, to 25, or even fewer." And of these men, Krupp would become the first amongst equals. His growing clout had quickly reached the very top of the German state. He quickly became a personal friend of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany, and it was a connection that gave the Krupp name almost an aristocratic aura. The family's old rival, however, took an opposite path. August Thiessen was a Republican at heart, a man who despised hereditary privilege and refused to cozy up to the Kaiser. While Krupp played politics, Thiessen stayed focused on steel. And both men were about to reap immense profit as the continent looked to ignite into a new war. But then Friedrich died without a male heir, leaving the succession uncertain to his vast empire. With help from the Kaiser himself, it was passed on to his son-in-law, who was called Gustav von Bollheim und Halbach. To keep up appearances, Halbach even took the Krupp name. It was a reminder of how much the name had become a brand and title in itself. As Germany finally plunged into World War I, the Krupp family exploded with profits. Their factories ran day and night producing artillery, shells, and armor. By the end of the war, the family had earned over 400 million marks. That would be about $1.75 billion today. But the massive demand also meant that their rival had also entered the arms industry, finally breaking up the Krupp monopoly. When the war ended in defeat and humiliation, millions of Germans were ruined by reparations and inflation. But for Krupp, Thiessen, and other industrial giants, the post-war chaos turned into yet more opportunity. Germany was supposed to disarm under the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. However, it never truly did. Krupp continued to design and even produce weapons in secret, often disguising them as agricultural machinery or selling blueprints abroad. The treaty also had another effect. The harsh terms weakened the German economy. By the 1920s, the smaller firms on the German middle class were collapsing under inflation and depression. The big industrial trusts like the Krupps, Thiessen, and other banking partners grew even stronger with this reduced competition. And to ensure that their position remained secure, they hedged their bet on another small upstart by the name of Adolf Hitler. You see, Germany was broken, politically divided, humiliated by war reparations, and terrified of communism. Hitler promised order, nationalism, and military revival. This was exactly the kind of rhetoric that spoke to the Krupps' longing for restored national pride. It had renewed demand for their weapons as well. At that time, Hitler's movement was still fringe, but Gustav Krupp saw potential. Within a few years, he began quietly financing Hitler and the Nazi Party. By then, Fritz Thiessen had inherited the Thiessen Empire. He made a similar gamble. Both became Hitler's major financial backers in his rise to power. In 1933, both men also poured funds behind the Nazis' infamous terror election. This was a campaign designed to secure Hitler's grip on Germany. Their support paid off. As the new regime took control, industry and government merged into one machine. The industrial dynasties that had backed Hitler were rewarded handsomely. When World War II began, Gustav's son Alfred Krupp took over the family business. The war turned out to be another massive windfall. The Nazi regime eliminated competition by expelling Jewish industrialists, allowing Krupp to absorb their assets. Alfred expanded the empire even further, seizing factories and mines across Europe. Amongst the affected was Robert Rothschild. He refused to sign over his holdings to Krupp. In response, he was sent to Auschwitz to die. Now, this was far from the worst atrocity he helped to commit. To meet wartime demand, Alfred turned to slave labor, a system known as extermination through work. His factories used 55,000 forced laborers, including 18,000 prisoners of war and 6,000 concentration camp inmates. Many of them were young women whose heads were shaved in the shape of a cross before being worked to death. Meanwhile, the man who once shared Krupp's political gamble grew horrified by what he saw. Fritz Thiessen was a conservative, but he wasn't a fanatic. He broke with the Nazis and he fled to Switzerland. Hitler responded by seizing the Thiessen fortune and revoking his citizenship. He was later captured and then sent to the Dachau concentration camp, the same system that he had once helped turn into a reality. When the war ended, both dynasties faced the reckoning of Nuremberg. The shocking part, however, was that their treatment differed. Alfred Krupp was sentenced to 12 years in prison and was ordered to forfeit all his property at first. But his punishment didn't last in the shifting politics of the Cold War. By 1950, he received a full pardon from the US High Commissioner in Germany. His holdings were restored, and within a decade, he rebuilt the Krupp empire. His personal fortune surpassed $1 billion at the time, which would be $13.4 billion in today's money. The Auschwitz inspector was once again one of Europe's richest men. Fritz Thyssen, however, fared worse. He wasn't in prison for very long, but he was ordered to hand over 15% of his assets to a restitution fund for victims of Nazi persecution. The two families made the same gamble in the 1930s. By the war's end, their fates could not have been more different. Krupp basically walked free, richer than ever, and Thyssen died in disgrace. His fortune diminished, and his legacy forever tarnished by regret. Look, karma has a way of getting back its dues, because after centuries of dominance, the Krupp family faced two blows that even their legendary fortune and political clout could not withstand. When short-term loans from Eastern European firms came due during West Germany's 66-67 recession, the company was caught off guard. The sudden end to Germany's post-war miracle and tightening credit markets left it unable to refinance its debts or sustain cash flow. The company had a staggering $600 million debt accumulated. It was the largest of any German company at the time. That was the moment that bankers stepped in and effectively took control of the decision-making. It marked the end of the House of Krupp. Alfred had only one son, Arndt, and he wanted no part of the burden. He formally renounced his right to inherit, leaving behind 4 centuries of the dynasty. Alfred died in 1967, and by the next year, the family empire had just become another corporation. To add insult to injury, Arndt had chosen the life of a playboy. He basically drifted through luxury, scandal, and headlines that enraged the workers whose fathers had built the company's legacy. Arndt had spent freely, lived extravagantly, and died childless and in debt, despised by those who once revered the Krupp name. After 4 centuries of recorded history, the House of Krupp was officially over, but in a twist dripping with irony, the great Krupp empire was eventually merged with its old rival, Thyssen, in 1997. The two companies that had once competed to arm Germany now existed under the same corporate logo. I mean, it's pretty funny if you think about it. Look, the history of the Krupp dynasty reminds us that no dynasty basically lasts forever. But here's what the story really teaches us. With enough money and the right connections, you can literally get away with mass murder. Alfred Krupp used slave labor. He built weapons for genocide, and he died a billionaire with almost no consequences. Today, ThyssenKrupp operates in 78 countries. You've probably ridden in their elevators dozens of times without knowing that you're in a box basically built by the corporate descendant of Hitler's arms dealer. The family name died, but the fortune lived on. But the question is, how many other corporate empires have similar skeletons buried in their foundations? If you made it this far, leave a skull emoji in the comments. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and check out this video that I made about the Rockefellers. Also, please make sure to subscribe to my Substack so that you get early access to my videos. Thanks so much and see you soon.